The security footage would later be analyzed frame by military investigators, congressional oversight committees, and millions of shocked viewers who couldn't believe what they were witnessing on their screens. It was 11:47 a.m. on a Saturday morning at Fort Braxton when Sergeant Rebecca Mitchell made what would become the most catastrophic mistake in modern military history, screaming at her commanding officer to kneel in public humiliation, surrounded by civilian witnesses. While multiple cameras captured every moment of what military legal experts would later describe as the most blatant case of insubordination and racially motivated abuse of authority ever recorded on a United States military installation. The sprawling concrete and steel complex of Fort Braxton gleamed like a fortress in the harsh Carolina sun, its orderly rows of buildings reflecting the disciplined chaos of America's third-largest military base during its busiest visitor weekend of the month. Families streamed through the main gate security checkpoints, their excited conversations mixing with the mechanical symphony of military vehicles, distant training exercises, and the constant hum of air conditioning units fighting against the oppressive southern heat. It was a kind of ordinary Saturday that would be remembered forever by everyone who witnessed what was about to unfold in the commissary plaza between the main exchange and the Family Readiness Center. Sergeant Rebecca Mitchell, 28 years old and carrying herself with the aggressive swagger of someone who believed her 3 stripes made her the ultimate authority over every human being on the installation, had been patrolling the civilian areas for over 2 hours, her predatory instincts scanning the crowd for what she privately called opportunities for discipline enforcement. Her perfectly pressed uniform moved through the mixed military and civilian population with the deliberate menace of a shark cutting through water, its occupants' cold gray eyes constantly searching for any sign of what her narrow worldview categorized as disrespectful behavior toward military authority. Today, like every day for the past 18 months since her promotion to sergeant, Mitchell was hunting for someone to remind about their place in her version of military order. The tall black man in civilian clothes who caught Mitchell's attention was walking confidently through the commissary plaza, his bearing unmistakably military despite his casual weekend attire. Something about the sight of a well-built black man moving through her domain with such quiet authority triggered every insecurity and prejudice that festered in Mitchell's limited mind. In her experience, confident black men were either soldiers who needed to be reminded of their subordinate status, civilians who didn't understand military protocol, or threats to the natural hierarchy that required immediate correction. The possibility that this particular man might outrank every person on the base was literally inconceivable to someone whose own mediocrity had been masked by institutional protection and the blind obedience of soldiers too intimidated to challenge her authority. What Sergeant Rebecca Mitchell couldn't see, what her prejudices had blinded her to completely, was the small insignia pin discreetly placed on the man's civilian jacket, barely visible in the morning sun, but unmistakable to anyone who understood the symbols of military command authority. The eagle and stars of a full colonel, worn only by senior field-grade officers who had dedicated decades to earning the trust and responsibility of leading thousands of soldiers, caught the light like a warning beacon that Mitchell was too ignorant and too consumed by her own false sense of power to recognize. Below it, a simple nameplate would have read Colonel Marcus Thompson, Base Commander, for words that should have commanded immediate respect and perfect military courtesy from any enlisted soldier on Fort Braxton, but which would remain invisible to Mitchell until it was far too late to save her career. The commissary plaza behind them buzzed with the weekend energy of military families enjoying their hard-earned time together after another week of sacrifice and service. Inside the nearby buildings, soldiers were shopping for their families. Children were playing in designated areas while their parents conducted necessary errands. And veterans were gathering in the community center to share stories and maintain the bonds forged through shared service to their country. It was a microcosm of American military life at its best, a place where service members of every background united under the common cause of defending freedom and protecting the values that made their sacrifices meaningful. The bitter irony of what was about to happen just steps away from this symbol of military brotherhood would not be lost on the investigators, who would later review the footage with growing horror and disbelief. Colonel Marcus Thompson stepped toward the main exchange entrance with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to command but wise enough to recognize when situational awareness was required. At 45 years old, he possessed the kind of quiet authority that came from surviving combat deployments, where leadership meant the difference between soldiers coming home alive or in flag-draped coffins, where split-second tactical decisions could determine whether missions succeeded or failed catastrophically. His weekend civilian clothes were deliberately casual, khaki pants, and a polo shirt that allowed him to move among his soldiers and their families without the formal barrier of rank insignia creating artificial distance. His bearing spoke of earned authority combined with genuine humility, the posture of someone who had climbed from enlisted private to base commander through pure merit, unwavering moral courage, and the kind of leadership that inspired rather than intimidated. Sergeant Mitchell watched the colonel's movements from across the plaza, her mind already constructing the narrative she would use to justify what she was planning to do. This was the same mental process she had perfected over 18 months of stripe-wearing bullying, the transformation of confidence into arrogance, of dignity into disrespect, of military bearing into evidence of attitude that needed aggressive correction. In Mitchell's twisted worldview, the calm composure with which Colonel Thompson carried himself was proof of civilian arrogance that needed to be humbled by military authority. The quality of his civilian clothes was evidence that he didn't understand his place in the military hierarchy. The professional bearing was camouflage designed to hide disrespectful intentions toward the uniformed personnel who kept him safe. Every detail was filtered through the lens of Mitchell's insecurities and transformed into justification for the public humiliation that was about to escalate into a court-martial case. The irony was so perfect it seemed orchestrated by some cosmic sense of military justice. Less than 48 hours earlier, Colonel Thompson had concluded a high-level meeting with the Pentagon about implementing new dignity and respect policies designed to prevent exactly the kind of abuse that Mitchell was now planning to inflict. The conference room where Thompson had argued for stronger protection of soldiers' civil rights was visible from the commissary plaza, where one of his own NCOs was about to provide the most compelling evidence possible for why such protection was desperately needed. Military families were beginning their weekend routines, unaware that they were about to become witnesses to a defining moment in the ongoing struggle between institutional prejudice and true military leadership. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez locked her car and headed toward the commissary, her 15 years of military experience giving her an instinctive awareness of brewing trouble between soldiers. Master Sergeant James Wilson checked his phone as he walked toward the exchange, his military police background having taught him to recognize the warning signs of authority abuse from a distance. Civilian spouse Jennifer Chun adjusted her shopping list as she began walking with her children, her husband's 20-year Army career having taught her to identify when military situations were about to spiral out of control. None of them yet realized that they were about to witness the most spectacular example of military ignorance and command authority meeting, an explosive collision that any of them had ever seen. In a few minutes, they would watch a sergeant attempt to publicly humiliate her base commander, while security cameras recorded every second of the encounter. They would see prejudice collide with legitimate authority so violently that it would shatter careers, reform policies, and create legal precedents that would be studied in military leadership courses for decades to come. The stage was set on a busy military plaza, where respect had come calling in the form of a distinguished officer whose authority derived not from stripes or shouting, but from the trust of his soldiers and the weight of command responsibility earned through decades of exemplary service. Sergeant Rebecca Mitchell was about to learn the most expensive lesson of her military career, that true authority doesn't announce itself with threats and public humiliation, and that the quiet dignity of genuine leadership can be more devastating than all the false bravado and manufactured intimidation in the world. But what this power-hungry sergeant was about to discover would shatter her worldview forever and turn this routine harassment into a viral moment that would end her military career and spark nationwide reforms in military culture. Before we see this arrogant NCO learn exactly who she was trying to humiliate, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell, Because stories like this prove that respect is earned through character, not demanded through fear, and you won't want to miss what happens when prejudice meets the highest military authority on the base. Now, let's watch this sergeant get the reality check of a lifetime. The Carolina sun beat down mercilessly on the concrete plaza of Fort Braxton, but the heat that was about to be generated by the collision between ignorance and command authority would make the southern temperature seem cool by comparison. All the pieces were in position, the cameras were recording, the witnesses were gathering, and military justice was about to be served in a way that would restore faith in the system while destroying the career of a soldier who had spent months abusing the very authority she was sworn to respect and protect. But before we see this arrogant sergeant learn exactly who she was trying to humiliate, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. Because stories like this prove that respect is earned through character, not assumed through prejudice, and you won't want to miss what happens when ignorance meets military authority. Now let's watch this power-hungry sergeant get the reality check of a lifetime. To understand why what happened next on that sweltering Fort Braxton morning would be so devastating for Sergeant Rebecca Mitchell, you need to know exactly who this woman was and how 18 months of unchecked authority had transformed an insecure small-town recruit into a stripe-wearing predator whose sense of invincibility was about to be shattered by the most powerful military officer on the installation. Rebecca Mitchell had been born in 1995 in Millfield, South Carolina's most isolated rural community, the eldest daughter of a family whose narrow worldview had been shaped by generations of economic stagnation and cultural resentment. Her father, Dale Mitchell, was a failed mechanic who had built his identity around complaints about outsiders taking opportunities that he believed belonged to people like him by birthright. Her mother, Sandra, was a former factory worker turned disability recipient whose social media presence consisted mainly of sharing posts about traditional values and the decline of respect for authority in modern America. From her earliest memories, Rebecca had been taught that the world was divided into those who commanded respect and those who were commanded, those who enforced order and those who needed to be kept in line. Her high school experience at Millfield Regional had reinforced these lessons with a subtle but unmistakable message that success meant having power over others, while failure meant being subject to someone else's authority. When classmates from military families spoke about honor and service, Rebecca learned to see it as weakness disguised as virtue. When she encountered people from different backgrounds, Rebecca was taught to view their differences as threats to the natural order rather than opportunities for understanding. The military recruiter who had visited Millfield High during Rebecca's senior year had promised her something she had craved her entire life: legitimate authority backed by institutional power. Staff Sergeant Williams had talked about leadership opportunities, advanced training, and the respect that came with wearing the uniform of the United States Army. Rebecca had absorbed every word like gospel, finally finding a pathway that would transform her from someone who felt powerless in her small town into someone who could exercise control over others with legal protection. Basic training at Fort Moore had been Rebecca's first taste of real discipline, but she had fundamentally misunderstood its purpose. While other recruits learned that military authority was about serving others and protecting something greater than themselves, Rebecca saw only the mechanics of power: how drill sergeants used volume and intimidation to achieve compliance, how rank created instant obedience, how fear could be more effective than respect in controlling human behavior. She had graduated from basic training with adequate scores and a disturbing pattern that her training cadre had noted but failed to address: an eagerness to volunteer for positions that gave her authority over her fellow soldiers. Her first assignment to Fort Braxton had been Rebecca's introduction to the intoxicating reality of military hierarchy. As a private, she had chafed under the authority of her NCOs, but she had studied their methods with the focus of someone preparing for her own opportunity to wield power. She had watched how certain sergeants used their rank to humiliate soldiers, how they transformed military courtesy into weapons of psychological control, and how they justified their behavior as necessary discipline rather than personal satisfaction. The promotion to sergeant after 4 years had been the most dangerous moment in Rebecca Mitchell's military career, though no one had recognized it at the time. The promotion ceremony had been held on a crisp October morning 18 months earlier, with Rebecca Mitchell standing at attention as the base commander. Ironically, the same Colonel Thompson she was now about to humiliate had pinned the sergeant's stripes to her uniform. The ceremony had been routine, one of dozens held that month as qualified soldiers advanced through the ranks based on time and service, technical competence, and leadership evaluations that had somehow missed the warning signs festering beneath Mitchell's carefully maintained facade of military professionalism. Rebecca's immediate supervisor, Staff Sergeant Williams, had tried to mentor the newly promoted NCO during her first weeks of expanded responsibility. Williams, a 12-year veteran, whose own rise through the ranks had taught her the delicate balance between firmness and fairness, had attempted to show Rebecca that true military leadership meant developing soldiers rather than dominating them. But Rebecca had interpreted Williams's guidance as weakness, her mentorship as naive idealism, and her success as evidence that the Army had been softened by political correctness rather than strengthened by genuine leadership principles. The pattern had begun almost immediately. Rebecca's first squad of junior enlisted soldiers had noticed her tendency to transform routine administrative tasks into opportunities for public humiliation. Private Martinez had been forced to do push-ups in front of the entire platoon for asking a legitimate question about leave procedures. Specialist Johnson had been assigned extra duty for what Rebecca claimed was inappropriate eye contact during a briefing. Private First Class Williams, no relation to the staff sergeant, had been subjected to a 15-minute public dressing down for a uniform infraction, so minor that other NCOs would have handled it with a quiet word of correction. The complaints had started within her first month as a sergeant, but they had disappeared into the same bureaucratic machinery that protected mediocre leaders throughout the military hierarchy. Private Martinez's formal complaint about public humiliation had been dismissed as a personality conflict between a new sergeant learning her role and a soldier adjusting to military standards. Specialist Johnson's report of discriminatory treatment had been filed under miscommunication and handled with counseling for both parties. The pattern that any objective observer could have recognized, a systematic campaign of intimidation targeting soldiers who reminded Rebecca of people she considered beneath her, had been reframed as growing pains in the leadership development process. Rebecca's tactics had grown more sophisticated as she learned to navigate the complaint system. She had mastered the art of documenting minor infractions that justified her disproportionate responses, creating paper trails that supported her version of events when challenged by higher-ranking NCOs or officers. Most importantly, she had identified other soldiers who shared her worldview, a small but vocal minority who viewed aggressive leadership as necessary discipline and who would provide corroborating testimony when her methods were questioned. Her first real test of power had come during a field training exercise 6 months into her tenure as sergeant. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a decorated combat veteran, had quietly questioned Rebecca's decision to deny water breaks to soldiers during a particularly demanding phase of the exercise. Rather than acknowledging the legitimate safety concern, Rebecca had interpreted the challenge as insubordination and had reported Rodriguez for undermining NCO authority in front of junior enlisted personnel. Colonel Marcus Thompson represented everything that Sergeant Rebecca Mitchell's twisted understanding of military authority could never comprehend. And in 20 minutes, that fundamental contradiction would destroy her career while revealing what genuine leadership actually looked like under pressure. Born in 1978 in East Cleveland, Ohio, to a single mother who worked double shifts as a certified nursing assistant, Marcus had learned early that respect was something you earned through character rather than demanded through volume. While Mitchell was growing up in small-town privilege that taught her the world owed her deference, Marcus was studying by candlelight when the electricity was shut off, walking 2 miles to school through neighborhoods where survival meant understanding that true strength came from protecting others rather than intimidating them. His mother, Patricia Thompson, had raised him with military discipline despite never serving herself, teaching him that authority without accountability was just another form of weakness disguised as strength. The Army recruiter who had visited Marcus's high school had offered him something different than what Rebecca would later seek. Not power over others, but the opportunity to serve something greater than himself. Staff Sergeant Davis had talked about leadership through example, about the responsibility that came with wearing the uniform, and about the sacred trust between those who command and those who follow. Marcus had absorbed every word with the hunger of someone who understood that real leadership meant carrying the weight of other people's lives and dreams, not using them as stepping stones for personal satisfaction. Basic training at Fort Benning had been Marcus's introduction to the true meaning of military service. While Mitchell would later see only the mechanics of control, Marcus learned that every drill sergeant who pushed him to his limits was investing in his ability to bring soldiers home alive from situations where leadership failures meant flag-draped coffins and grieving families. He had graduated as the honor graduate of his class, not because he was the strongest or the fastest, but because his training cadre recognized something rare, a natural leader who made everyone around him better rather than smaller. His first deployment to Afghanistan as a young lieutenant had been Marcus's baptism by fire in the realities of combat leadership. In the mountains outside Kandahar, he had learned that soldiers would follow officers who shared their dangers and their hardships, who made decisions based on mission success and soldier welfare rather than personal advancement. The Bronze Star he had earned during a firefight that saved 3 wounded soldiers had been meaningful not because of the recognition it brought him, but because of the families who still had their sons and fathers, because he had refused to leave anyone behind. 15 years and 4 combat deployments had forged Marcus into the kind of leader that textbooks tried to describe but rarely captured. Someone who commanded through competence rather than intimidation, who built others up rather than tearing them down, who understood that true authority came from the consent of those being led rather than the fear of those being controlled. His rise through the ranks from enlisted private to base commander had been earned through every metric that mattered. Soldiers developed under his leadership, missions accomplished under his command, and units that performed better because he had shown them what excellence looked like when it was motivated by service rather than ego. The irony of his current situation was perfect in its symbolic power. Colonel Thompson had spent the morning conducting an unannounced assessment of how his soldiers treated civilians and each other when they thought no senior leadership was watching. He had chosen civilian clothes specifically to observe the true culture of his base, to see whether the values he tried to instill through official channels actually translated into daily behavior when soldiers believed themselves unobserved by command authority. What he was about to discover would prove both devastating and redemptive. Devastating because it would reveal that soldiers like Mitchell had been allowed to flourish under his command, but redemptive because it would provide him with the opportunity to demonstrate what genuine leadership looked like when confronted with the very abuse of authority he had dedicated his career to preventing. The stage was set with the precision of military planning and the inevitability of cosmic justice. Colonel Thompson walked across the commissary plaza at exactly 11:45 a.m., his civilian clothes and relaxed weekend bearing making him indistinguishable from the hundreds of military family members enjoying their Saturday morning routines. His informal assessment had already revealed troubling patterns. Junior soldiers who seemed unusually tense around certain NCOs, civilian spouses who appeared uncomfortable navigating base facilities, and an undercurrent of anxiety that suggested leadership problems he had not yet identified. Sergeant Mitchell had positioned herself near the main exchange entrance, like a predator claiming territory, her eyes scanning the mixed crowd of soldiers and civilians with the calculated intensity of someone looking for opportunities to assert dominance. The weekend duty roster had assigned her to courtesy patrol, officially designed to assist families and maintain base security, but which Mitchell had transformed into a hunting ground for anyone who failed to show what she considered appropriate deference to her authority. The fatal convergence began when Thompson paused to check his phone near the base exchange, his calm confidence and quality civilian attire immediately triggering Mitchell's prejudices. In her narrow worldview, successful-looking black men in her domain fell into only 2 categories: soldiers who needed to be reminded of their subordinate status, or civilians who didn't understand proper respect for military authority. The possibility that she was observing her base commander, the officer who had personally pinned her sergeant stripes 18 months earlier, was beyond her capacity to imagine. Federal security cameras positioned throughout the plaza were recording every moment with high-definition clarity, their digital eyes capturing what would soon become the most watched example of military justice in modern history. Smartphone cameras in the hands of military families were beginning to notice the brewing confrontation, their owners' military experience, giving them an instinctive awareness that something significant was about to unfold. The weekend crowd that had been enjoying peaceful family time was unknowingly positioning themselves to become witnesses to a defining moment in military leadership and accountability. Mitchell's radio crackled with routine-based security chatter as she made her decision to approach the man she perceived as a target for authority assertion. Her mind was already constructing the justification she would use later: suspicious behavior, failure to respond appropriately to military presence, possible security threat requiring investigation. The same mental gymnastics that had allowed her to transform legitimate questions into insubordination and minor uniform infractions into major disciplinary issues was now preparing to justify the most catastrophic mistake of her military career. Thompson, absorbed in reviewing base incident reports on his phone, remained unaware that he was about to become the victim of the very leadership failure he was investigating. The irony was devastating. The base commander seeking to understand authority abuse was seconds away from experiencing it firsthand, while the sergeant who represented everything wrong with unchecked power was about to destroy her career by targeting the one person on base with both the authority and integrity to ensure real consequences. "Excuse me, SIR," Sergeant Mitchell barked across the plaza, her voice cutting through the peaceful weekend atmosphere like a blade through silk. The word "sir" dripped with sarcasm and false courtesy, designed to sound respectful to casual observers while conveying unmistakable disrespect to her target. "I need to speak with you about your presence in this area." Colonel Thompson looked up from his phone with the measured composure of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations with grace. His military bearing was evident even in civilian clothes: the straight posture, the direct eye contact, the calm confidence that came from decades of earning respect rather than demanding it. "Good morning, Sergeant. How can I help you?" The respectful response only inflamed Mitchell's prejudices further. In her twisted interpretation of military hierarchy, civilians who showed proper deference were suspicious, while those who demonstrated confidence were dangerous. Thompson's polite professionalism was evidence of arrogance that needed immediate correction through public humiliation. "You can help me by explaining what you're doing loitering around military facilities," Mitchell snapped, stepping closer with the aggressive posture she had perfected through months of intimidating soldiers and civilians alike. "This area is for authorized personnel and their families. I haven't seen you check in with security, and your behavior is concerning to military personnel in the area." The crowd began to take notice. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, shopping with her family nearby, recognized the signs of an NCO about to abuse her authority. Master Sergeant Wilson, walking toward the exchange, immediately understood that he was witnessing something that would require intervention. Civilian spouses started pulling out their phones, their military experience teaching them to document situations that could escalate beyond reasonable boundaries. "Sergeant, I understand you're doing your job," Thompson replied with the patience that had made him legendary among soldiers who had served under his command. "I'm here conducting personal business, just like any other family member on base. Is there a specific regulation or security concern you'd like to discuss?" The calm reasonableness of Thompson's response triggered every insecurity that Mitchell had been nursing since her promotion to sergeant. Here was a black man who refused to be intimidated by her uniform, who spoke with the educated articulation that reminded her of officers who had questioned her methods, who carried himself with a quiet authority that she could never achieve despite her desperate attempts to command respect through fear. "Don't get smart with me," Mitchell snarled, her voice rising to ensure maximum public attention for what she was planning to do next. "I don't like your attitude, and I don't appreciate civilians who think they can disrespect military authority. You're going to show proper respect for this uniform, or you're going to learn what happens when people like you forget their place." The racist implication hung in the Carolina air like poison gas. Military families within earshot stopped their conversations, their faces reflecting the horror of watching a soldier desecrate the uniform with bigotry. Smartphones rose throughout the plaza as witnesses began recording what they instinctively understood would become evidence of systematic failure in military leadership accountability. "Sergeant Mitchell," Thompson said quietly, reading her name tape with the same calm voice he had used to de-escalate conflicts in combat zones. "I think there may be a misunderstanding here. Perhaps we should." "Shut up," Mitchell screamed, her composure finally shattering as she realized her authority was being questioned by someone who should have been cowering in fear. "Get on your knees, boy. Right here, right now. You're going to learn some respect for military authority, or you're going to spend the rest of your weekend explaining yourself to base security." The words echoed across Fort Braxton like gunshots, freezing every conversation and stopping every movement within a 100-yard radius. Federal security cameras captured the moment in high-definition clarity. Dozens of smartphones recorded the most blatant display of racist abuse of military authority ever documented. The sound of a sergeant ordering her base commander to kneel in public humiliation would be replayed millions of times within hours. Colonel Thompson stood perfectly still, his expression reflecting not anger, but profound sadness at witnessing the corruption of military values he had dedicated his life to upholding. Can you believe this sergeant just tried to force her commanding officer to kneel in front of dozens of witnesses? The look on her face when she realized who she was screaming at was absolutely priceless. But wait until you see what happened next. If you're loving watching this power trip backfire spectacularly, smash that like button and let me know in the comments. Have you ever seen someone's authority complex destroy their career this completely? The silence that followed Mitchell's explosive command lasted exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds that would be dissected frame by military investigators, civil rights attorneys, and millions of viewers who would witness the exact moment when ignorance met its devastating reckoning with truth. "Sergeant Mitchell, stand down." The voice cut through the plaza like a thunderclap, carrying 20 years of command authority that could not be ignored or misinterpreted. Master Sergeant Wilson was running toward the confrontation, his military police background and base security clearance having allowed him to recognize Colonel Thompson immediately despite the civilian clothes. Mitchell spun toward the interruption, her face twisted with rage at having her authority challenged by another NCO. "Master Sergeant, this civilian is being disrespectful to military personnel, and I am handling the situation according to base security protocols." "That's not a civilian, you absolute fool," Wilson roared, his voice carrying the horror of watching a career suicide in real time. "That's Colonel Marcus Thompson, the base commander. You just ordered your commanding officer to kneel in public." The words hit Mitchell like a physical blow. The color drained from her face as her mind struggled to process information that contradicted everything her prejudices had told her was possible. Her eyes darted between Wilson's horrified expression and Thompson's calm dignity, searching desperately for evidence that this was some kind of mistake, some misunderstanding that could still be explained away. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez reached the scene at a dead run, her 15 years of military experience having taught her to recognize disasters before they became irreversible. "Ma'am, please step back from Colonel Thompson immediately," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone trying to prevent further catastrophe. "Sir, on behalf of every professional soldier on this base, I apologize for this completely unacceptable behavior." The crowd that had gathered to witness the confrontation erupted in shocked murmurs and gasps as the truth spread through the plaza like wildfire. Military families who had been recording Mitchell's abuse suddenly understood they had captured something unprecedented. A sergeant attempting to publicly humiliate her base commander, while federal cameras documented every second of the career-ending spectacle. "No, no, no," Mitchell whispered, her voice barely audible as the magnitude of her mistake began to penetrate the wall of arrogance that had protected her from reality for 18 months. "That's impossible. He's just he was acting suspicious, and civilians need to show respect for." "Sergeant Mitchell," Colonel Thompson said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of command authority that needed no volume to be unmistakable. "You have just committed the most serious breach of military discipline and civil rights violation in the history of this installation." You ordered your commanding officer to kneel based on nothing more than racial prejudice, in front of dozens of witnesses, while security cameras recorded every word. Can you believe this sergeant just tried to force her base commander to kneel in front of dozens of military families? The look on her face when she realized who she was screaming at was absolutely priceless. But wait until you see what happened next. If you're loving watching this power trip backfire so spectacularly, smash that like button and let me know in the comments. Have you ever seen someone's prejudice destroy their career this completely in real time? Mitchell's hands began shaking as the full weight of military justice prepared to crush the delusions that had sustained her abuse of authority. Reality had arrived with devastating precision, and there would be no escaping the consequences of what those cameras had captured. The next 30 minutes unfolded like a masterclass in how military justice operates, when the evidence is overwhelming and the victim holds the highest command authority on the installation. Command Sergeant Major Davis arrived at the scene within minutes, took one look at the crowd of horrified military families surrounding his disgraced NCO, and immediately understood that Fort Braxton was facing a catastrophe that would be studied in military leadership courses for decades. Sergeant Mitchell, you are hereby relieved of all duties pending immediate investigation by the Inspector General, Davis commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned his rank through 3 decades of exemplary service. You will report to my office at 0800 Monday morning with your attorney present. Do not speak to anyone about this incident. Do not access any military systems. And pray that the federal investigators, who are already reviewing this footage, decide to show mercy. The transformation of the scene was immediate and complete. Mitchell, who had been swaggering with false authority just minutes earlier, now stood isolated and trembling as the full weight of military justice crashed down upon her. The same military families who had been recording her abuse of power were now providing witness statements to Command Sergeant Major Davis, each account more damning than the last. Colonel Thompson, displaying the grace under pressure that had defined his entire military career, declined to have Mitchell arrested on the spot, not out of mercy, but because he understood that military prosecutors would want to build an airtight case that would serve as a permanent example of what happens when prejudice corrupts military authority. The viral explosion began within an hour. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's smartphone footage had been uploaded to social media with the caption, "Racist Sergeant Tries to Humiliate Base Commander," and the video was spreading across platforms faster than Fort Braxton's Public Affairs Office could contain it. Cable news networks were already running breaking news alerts, military legal experts were being called in for emergency commentary, and civil rights organizations were preparing statements about the systematic nature of authority abuse that could lead to such spectacular ignorance. But the most devastating consequence was yet to come. Within 2 hours, the Army's Criminal Investigation Division had opened a federal investigation into Mitchell's conduct, not just for this incident, but for her entire 18-month pattern of racially motivated harassment and abuse of authority. Every complaint that had been dismissed by her chain of command was being reopened with federal oversight. Every victim who had been ignored was finding their voice through military legal assistance attorneys. And every incident Mitchell had been involved in was being reviewed for evidence of civil rights violations and conduct unbecoming. Mitchell was suspended from all duties within hours. Her security clearance was immediately revoked, and military prosecutors were considering charges that could result in years in federal prison, followed by a dishonorable discharge that would strip her of all veterans' benefits. The sergeant who had believed her stripes made her untouchable was about to discover that civil rights violations against superior officers carry consequences that no amount of false bravado can protect against. The disciplinary action was swift and comprehensive. Mitchell's promotion to sergeant was immediately suspended pending review, with strong indication that she would be reduced in rank to private before facing court-martial proceedings. Her military occupational specialty was changed to prevent her from ever holding authority over other soldiers again. Most devastatingly, her personnel file was flagged with codes that would make her unemployable in any law enforcement or security position for the remainder of her life. Colonel Thompson, meanwhile, used the incident as a catalyst for the most comprehensive dignity and respect reform initiative in Fort Braxton's history. The base that had allowed Mitchell's behavior to flourish for 18 months became a model for military installations nationwide, proving that true leaders transform personal injustice into systemic change that protects everyone who serves. The weekend that had begun with Mitchell hunting for opportunities to humiliate others ended with her becoming the subject of the most watched military justice case in modern history. The security footage became training material for military academies nationwide, not as an example of proper leadership, but as a cautionary tale about what happens when prejudice meets genuine authority under the unforgiving eye of digital cameras and constitutional accountability. Mitchell's story proves that false authority built on prejudice eventually meets its reckoning with real leadership, while Thompson's response demonstrates that character under pressure will always triumph over the temporary power of rank when justice has cameras rolling and the truth refuses to stay hidden. The Carolina sun that had witnessed Mitchell's arrogance ultimately illuminated Thompson's grace under fire, proving that dignity and earned authority will always prevail over false power and manufactured respect when the evidence is overwhelming and the moral lines are clear. Colonel Thompson returned to his quiet work of leading soldiers and protecting the values they swore to defend. But now he carried something new. Proof that even in America's darkest moments of institutional prejudice, character and competence can prevail when they're backed by constitutional authority and witnessed by a world hungry for accountability. Justice might be delayed by bureaucracy and protected by institutional inertia, but stories like this prove it's never denied when good people refuse to stay silent and cameras capture every moment of truth meeting power. Sergeant Mitchell learned the hard way that true military leadership is about serving others, not serving your own prejudices. Colonel Thompson's response proved that real authority doesn't need to shout, threaten, or humiliate. It commands respect through character, competence, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing your power is earned rather than inherited. This viral moment became a turning point for military culture, showing that accountability can arrive swiftly when dignity meets prejudice and justice gets served with military precision. Subscribe for more stories where respect gets earned the hard way and karma gets delivered with the efficiency that only military justice can provide. Sergeant Mitchell learned the hard way that true military leadership is about serving others, not serving your own ego. Colonel Thompson's response proved that real authority doesn't need to shout, threaten, or humiliate. It commands respect through character and competence. This viral moment became a turning point for military culture, showing that accountability can arrive swiftly when truth meets power and cameras capture every devastating second. Subscribe for more stories where respect gets earned the hard way and justice gets served with military precision.